They liked him. They loved him. They regarded him as one of the people. He was the people's prime minister. And that is how he will stay, how he will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever. Just joshing with you. Well, he's off then, isn't he? Boris Johnson, there he goes. Forced out of Parliament, according to his own words. Not quite what's happened, is it, Boris Johnson? Let's just go through, shall we? The letter of resignation by our former Prime Minister. That's right. He was in charge of the country for a while. One of the chief architects of this country's calamitous state, standing down as an MP with immediate effect to spend more time with all that dosh he's raking in. Very straightforward. He faces a Privileges Committee investigation into his deceit during Partygate, when, just a little recap, people couldn't hold the hands of their dying relatives, but this lot were getting so sick they were vomiting down the sides of karaoke machines in number 10, the Hacienda upon Thames, which it became during the pandemic. He's been forced out because he's a liar and a cheat. That's what's happened. That's what he brought this on himself. Doesn't seem to realise that. Reality, Boris Johnson, not overlapping circles. So he says it is very sad to be leaving Parliament, at least for now, but above all, I am bewildered and appalled that I could be forced out anti-democratically by a committee chaired and managed by a Harriet Harman with such egregious bias. Oh, Crimea River. Firstly, the committee's got a Tory majority, mate, so let's just knock that one on its head. Clearly, the evidence was overwhelming. We watched your testimony. We watched it, I mean, if you can call it a testimony. It was a slightly ill-tempered bunch of gibberish. Clearly, someone who did not tell Parliament the truth, and it looks as though the committee concluded that he misled deliberately the House of Commons. He denies that. Well, I guess we've just got to decide whether we trust Boris Johnson with the truth, haven't we? Now, he says, of course, it suits the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP to do whatever they can to remove him from Parliament. Sadly, as we saw in July last year, there are currently some Tory MPs who share that view. I'm not alone in thinking that there's a witch hunt underway to take revenge for Brexit and ultimately to reverse the 2016 referendum result. Yeah, I mean, the current Prime Minister campaigned for Brexit, Boris Johnson. You're probably aware of that. Rishi Sunak was not on the Remain side. He was on your side. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. I mean, what... The idea there's some sort of Remain clique, which is now basically somehow running the show and driving out true blue, ardent Brexiteers, is clearly an absolute nonsense. I mean, you can argue a lot of the current government are more committed Brexiteers than Boris Johnson, in the sense he doesn't really believe in anything, and quite famously wrote one column supporting Leave and another supporting Remain. But this will fuel conspiratorial sentiment amongst Brexiteers. Sorry, not Brexiteers. Very important we don't say that. You could say 52% of people who voted in the 2016 election were Brexiteers, and they're not all the same as the Tory Brexiteers by any stretch of the imagination. But there's a bunch of right-wing Brexiteers, which the likes of GB News will platform and, I guess, kind of provide succour for and inflame their passions ever further. They're now going to go on the absolute rampage, claiming, oh, they're out to get us, they're out to get us, even as their hard Brexit deal, which is currently very much in place, continues to trash the economy. Now, he says, when I left office last year, the government was only a handful of points behind in the polls. That gap has now massively widened. Just a few years after winning the biggest majority in almost half a century, the majority is clearly at risk. Do you know, he's got a point. This is the only thing I'll concede to him. He's got a point in the first part. They were about 7 points behind on average, and then they ended up 20 points behind. And now it's kind of, I think they're on about 13, 12 points behind. The problem there was if you're going to get rid of someone like the Prime Minister, who did win an election, obviously in the midst of scandal, make sure you don't have someone lined up who's going to literally detonate, well, not literally, but detonate the economy and send people's mortgages spiking. Because the problem with Boris Johnson's, or what happened with Boris Johnson's removal, is the Conservative Party thought Boris Johnson's government was too left-wing. They concluded that they wanted a true blue Tory who'd finally do all the big raging right-wing Tory things they always wanted to do. She tried to do it, and then the economy nearly collapsed. Which is why the Tories then plummeted in the polls. Now, he says, we must not be afraid of a properly Conservative government. Why? Well, you had that under Liz Truss, if that's where we're going. We tried that. Can I just emphasise we tried that. Anyone who's obviously suffering the consequences of that, what happened to mortgages and rents, people often forget rents. Private rents go up as mortgages do. Yeah, we got that. Anyway, party has time to recover its mojo and its ambition to win the next election. The point I'd make about, he says we must not be afraid of a properly Conservative government, though, is, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor of the Exchequer under him, but actually Boris Johnson was setting, that was his economic policy under Boris Johnson. He's kind of pretending that wasn't his policies. He actually had a relatively interventionist policy. He, in rhetoric, abandoned austerity. They're not in practice. They baked in the cuts, but they talked about increasing investment, increasing the state in lots of ways. In lots of ways, it was a departure from the sort of David Cameron, George Osborne form of conservatism, which was just roll back the state. So he's basically all over the place. He can't himself work out what his own ideology is, because he really doesn't believe in very much apart from himself, and never did. Now, he said, on the one hand, it is quite funny that a man who, tragically for all of us, won the last election has now been forced out of Parliament altogether. But there's a straightforward reason which we do need to keep restating, which is he was obviously always unsuitable for power. And the people who put him in power knew he was unsuitable. They put him there for very cynical political reasons. He is, of course, an Etonian who, by virtue of his extreme privilege, was repeatedly allowed to survive about 1 billion things which would fell anyone. Just one of those things would fell anyone, someone from an ordinary background who grew up at a council estate, or had a regional accent or whatever, who wasn't a white guy. His childhood ambition, of course, not a joke, was to become world king, a man driven by rampant ambition, and his privilege allowed him to constantly fall upwards. He was sacked twice for lying, once by a newspaper, once by a Conservative leader. He lies as easily as he breathes. Peter O'Byrne's written an entire hefty book documenting his lies and pointed out the many, many other lies that didn't make it for reasons of space. He discussed beating up a journalist once with his friend. With the help of the likes, of course, of Have I Got News For You, though, he was turned into this soppy kind of jokey, amiable figure. Oh, it's our Boris. We all had to call him by his first name. Boris. They really do have to take responsibility for this. But, this is a man who was accused of sexual harassment. He's a man who took drugs and then enforced a war on drugs, which locks up young black men for the same crime as a lot of Tory MPs have indulged in the same thing. He edited The Spectator when it churned out, true to form, in Spectator form, gratuitously racist material, including one article arguing that black people had a lower IQ than white people, as well as anti-Semitism for that matter. He wrote a book himself depicting Jews as controlling the media. He once wrote about pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, tank-top bum boys, his words, not mine. When he once wrote that article comparing the veil for Muslim women to letterboxes, and you saw a surge in hate crimes in this country. You literally had Muslim women being harassed in the streets in the aftermath. He negotiated a Brexit deal, which has proved a total catastrophe, from red tape to slashing growth. As for COVID, blimey, where do you even begin with that? Lockdown too late. Then as a consequence, huge numbers of people died unnecessarily. Did the same thing again later on in the year, whether it be vulnerable care, hospital patients being sent back to care homes without being tested, where the virus was seeded, killing many thousands of care home residents, whether it be the calamity of the lack of PPE, and then the scandalous PPE contracts for those well connected with the Conservative Party, public money thrown at them, sometimes for unusable kit. The fact that we were told that 20,000 deaths would be a good result. We ended up with over 200,000. Before his downfall, what began his downfall back in 2020 is when he attempted to force Tory MPs to vote in favour of overturning the suspension of Owen Paterson, who'd been accused of an egregious breach of lobbying rules. We then, of course, had Partygate, where, again, people who watched their relatives buried on Zoom, where you got people across the country being fined disproportionately, I have to say, people who are black, people in poorer communities, where you got homeless people being arrested for violating lockdown rules, and this lot were, as I said, partying like it was going quite out of fashion. No, I mean, we could go on. The fact is that this lying, shambolic, demagogic, poisonous joke of a man was ever allowed near power is itself a damning indictment of all of those who put him in power. You know, I remember once, I met in the green room before I went on TV, a Tory MP said to me, we Tory MPs will never let him go in the final two for Tory members to be able to vote on him because he's unsuitable for office, he's a liar, he's full of, he's this demagogic, self-obsessed, blah, 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 blah. And then a few months later released his own personal endorsement video about why Boris Johnson was the most suitable person to become Prime Minister. They knew who he was. But back in 2019, they thought that he was the antidote to what they saw as the twin threats of Corbynism and Farageism, so they put him there knowing he was unsuitable for office, and then as a consequence we suffered the disaster. Tory MPs, Tory media, and a lot of frankly Labour MPs who clearly some of them did prefer a Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister than Jeremy Corbyn in the end. Now, this is a man, as I said, who's always fallen upwards, and he will now for the rest of his life live a life of luxury and affluence. He'll get millions thrown at him for speaking engagements and all the rest. He'll be always held up by the right-wing Tory Brexiteers as this man who's been done over, and the establishment have gone after him, an Etonian done in by the establishment, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, this was a man who was so unbelievably shambolic and ludicrously ill-suited for office that he brought this on himself, even though for years he was allowed to get away with scandal after scandal after scandal, with misdemeanors and all the rest of it, because the media turned him into this cuddly figure. They allowed him to survive those scandals. They created him and they put him in power until it became so obviously ludicrous that this man could remain as Prime Minister. Never let them get away with it. Never let the people who put him in power get away with it. Never let the people who facilitated his rule and his leadership until they then washed their hands of him because he became too vulgar and too indefensible in their eyes, and then they moved on to the next disaster. Now, that's the final point, because it's easy to rant about Boris Johnson, I just have, okay? But this was a collective effort by the Conservatives. Look what they've done to this country. The longest fall in living standards since the early 19th century. Public services in collapse, a housing crisis, a lack of secure jobs. I mean, poverty, of course, blighting one of the richest countries that has ever existed. Infrastructure falling apart. Scandal after scandal. The fact that, if we look at the pandemic, how we were left exposed by what they did to the National Health Service in the run-up to it. We could go on. They reduced this country to a disastrous state. And Boris Johnson's played his role, don't get me wrong. But the whole lot, they were all in this together, to coin a phrase. And as Boris Johnson is turfed out of Parliament, and unfortunately that is not the last we're going to hear of him, don't let all of those fellow Tories who have led us to this catastrophe wash their hands of either him or what they have done. Never, ever, ever let them forget what they did. And never, ever, ever let them get away with it ever again. Please like, subscribe, do support us on patreon.com/ownjoes84. I'll see you in a bit.